On Christmas Eve of 1859, a woman named Rosa sat in the dark of the slave quarters at Belle Rive Plantation, a cane knife wrapped in rags by her side. Along the Mississippi River, the grand estates blazed with candles and echoed with hymns. But inside the quarters, there was only frost, coughing, and silence. In the big house, the Beauregard brothers drank wine and feasted on roasted meat, certain of their untouchable power. Yet by dawn, 4 masters would lie dead, and Rosa's name would be whispered in terror and awe. Before we continue, drop a comment. Do you believe she truly carries out her plan? Or will something unexpected change the night? The Mississippi River rolled slow and black under a swollen moon, its banks rimmed with frost. From the levee, Belle Rive looked like a kingdom carved from sugar and stone. Cypress garlands curled down white columns, lanterns glowed across wide verandas, and every window seemed to hum with life. Guests arriving by carriage heard the laughter of the Beauregard brothers pouring out over the night. Wine glasses clinked, fiddles played carols in Creole French, and the great house swelled with sound. To the outside world, Belle Rive was a vision of wealth and festivity. But only a few hundred yards away, the slave quarters sank in near darkness. The cold pressed through wooden cracks like teeth, gnawing at lungs and bones alike. No carols drifted there. Only coughs, the shuffle of tired feet, and the occasional whimper of a child who had nothing to dream about. Inside one of those shacks sat Rosa. 28 years old, her life had been spent polishing silver scrubbing linens and serving dishes she could never eat. She was known to the white household as quiet, obedient, almost invisible. But tonight her invisibility was a mask she no longer needed. At her side, beneath folded rags, lay the cane knife. It was the same tool she had used every autumn to strip cane in the fields, its blade long, curved, and heavy in the hand. She had sharpened it until the edge caught light, even in shadows. To most, it was just a laborer's tool meant to harvest sweetness from stalks. But Rosa had given it a different meaning. To her, it was memory solidified in steel. She thought of Jonah. His name beat like a drum inside her chest, louder than the fiddles echoing from the big house. When he had first arrived from the New Orleans auction block, shoulders square and eyes burning, he spoke of freedom as if it were a direction one could walk toward. He had whispered of Ohio, of mornings without whips, of nights without fear. He promised her that someday, somehow they would cross the river and keep walking until no one owned their names. Together they had stolen moments in the shadows of the smokehouse, tasting cornbread still warm from her hands, laughing quietly at the children who played chop the cane with sticks, swinging them like real blades. Jonah had said even children's games could carry hope. One day their play will mean harvest, not chains. Rosa had believed him. Then came Lucien Beauregard's smile, the eldest brother, 42, always quoting philosophers to justify cruelty. He had told Rosa that if she worked hard, if she made the house shine through the season, by spring, he would draw up papers of manumission. His voice was smooth, his glass of Madeira raised like a sacrament. Rosa had bowed her head and nodded, daring to let hope warm her bones. But the very next week, Jonah was gone, sold without warning, carted off to another plantation's mill yard. The news returned like poison. Jonah had tried to escape, limping on a broken foot. They caught him in this cane yard, tied him to a post, and broke him piece by piece, while the other slaves were forced to watch. By the time the overseer finished, Jonah's body was no longer recognizable. Rosa cooked the brothers' meals that day as usual. She scrubbed their boots, she folded their coats, but inside, something had calcified. Hope turned to iron. Tonight, the iron had shape. It was the cane knife beside her. The old man Jules, called Tonton by the others, sat near the fire across from Rosa. His voice cracked like old timber when he spoke. "Child, your eyes are too still tonight." She did not look up. Still water hides deep currents. She answered softly. Jules studied her a moment longer, then muttered a prayer in Creole under his breath. Outside, wind pressed against the door as if it too wanted to listen. Then the bells began to ring. Midnight Mass in St. James Parish had started, and the sound carried over the cane fields. To the devout, it was the voice of heaven. To Rosa, it was the echo of a grave being opened. Each toll was a countdown, each vibration a reminder that the night of reckoning had arrived. From the direction of the big house came more laughter, louder now, slurred and careless. Rosa could picture them all too clearly. Lucien bending over his ledgers between sips of wine, believing himself a philosopher king. Etienne slipping upstairs with a girl young enough to be his daughter, whispering promises no one believed. Marcel clutching his Bible, preaching obedience while his own lips dripped with liquor. and Baptiste, the youngest, restless and raging pistol clattering at his side, looking for an excuse to spill blood. 4 brothers, 4 debts carved into Rosa's memory. She reached for the rags, unwrapped the cane knife, and let the blade rest across her lap. Its weight steadied her heartbeat. She tested its balance once, then wrapped it again. The fire snapped, sending sparks into the dark like tiny omens. Rosa closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and whispered the names to herself, as if reciting a litany. Jonah, Mama, Celeste, the children who vanished without graves, each name a step, each step a strike. When she opened her eyes again, she saw through the cracks of the wooden wall the distant glow of the mansion. One candlelight flickered, then went out. She smiled faintly, just enough to show her teeth. The house of Beauregard thought its lights eternal, but Rosa had seen the first flame die. By the time the bells stopped ringing, nothing in Belle Rive would be the same. And as Rosa rose from the fire and tied her shawl tight around her shoulders, she knew she was not walking toward sin, but toward balance. The night was only beginning, and before it ended, the Beauregard brothers would learn that even the quiet ones remember. Rosa's footsteps carried her across the frozen dirt yard, her shawl drawn tight against the river wind. She walked past the cane sheds where stalks were stacked like bones, past the barrels of molasses that smelled of rot and sugar, and back into memory. The bells had quieted, but inside her chest they rang still, each toll an echo of Jonah's voice. She remembered the first time she saw him months before that night. The market in New Orleans had been bustling buyers in silk coats and hats, inspecting men and women as if they were horses. Rosa had gone with her mistress carrying parcels, eyes cast low. But she had lifted her gaze for one instant, and there he was, tall, shoulders squared, defiant even in chains. He was not born into servitude. His mother, she later learned, had been a freed woman until a forged document and a sheriff's greed erased her papers. Jonah carried himself with the kind of dignity that could not be bought or sold, though they tried. At Belle Rive, he was sent first to the fields, cutting cane beneath a punishing sun. Rosa watched from the big house windows as he swung the cane knife rhythm, sure arms strong. Within weeks, he had become skilled at breaking horses, calming them with a patience the overseers mistook for obedience. But Rosa saw more. At night, behind the smokehouse, when the moon rose over the river, he spoke to her in low tones about escape. He had heard of routes leading north of men called conductors who guided the lost through swamps and cities. One day, he whispered, touching her hand with fingers rough from rope, "We'll follow that smoke rising from the boiling cane. We'll make it our signal, our guide." She said nothing, but the warmth of his touch lit something in her that the cold could never reach. For a time, she allowed herself to imagine a future, small, fragile, but hers. Children laughing in open fields, not in chains, a cabin of their own. Laughter that was not stolen. Jonah's promises wrapped around her like a shawl against the winter. Then came Lucien. He summoned her into the parlor one evening, the fire-glowing curtains drawn the air heavy with tobacco smoke. He poured himself Madeira, swirled the glass, and fixed his pale eyes on her. "I've seen the way you look at Jonah," he said. Voice calm, almost gentle. "Do you want freedom?" She stayed silent, but he pressed. "Serve well through Christmas. Keep your head down. Make Belle Rive shine. Come spring, perhaps I'll write the papers." He smiled as he said it, the way one smiles at a child who believes in fairy tales. Rosa bowed. Said nothing, but that night she pressed her forehead to Jonah's chest and for once allowed herself to believe. The belief did not last. One morning, Jonah was gone. No warning, no farewell. Rosa learned the truth from a field hand who had overheard Marcel boasting they had sold Jonah to a plantation upriver. Got a fine price for him. Marcel had laughed, a fine price for a fine mule. Rosa confronted Lucien quietly, her voice steady. "You said spring." Lucien sipped his drink and looked at her over the rim. He wasn't part of the bargain. When she asked about herself, he smirked. "Be a good girl, Rosa. Spring still comes." She turned away without another word, but as she passed the kitchen, her hand brushed against the cleaver hanging by the hearth, and her fingers lingered on the handle just long enough for the thought to settle. The weeks that followed carved hollows into her. She learned what had become of Jonah not from the brothers, but from whispers among the enslaved. He had tried to run in his second week at the new plantation. They caught him near the riverbank, his foot still injured from chains. The overseer was known for cruelty. They tied Jonah to a post and made others watch as they shattered his legs one blow at a time. They left him there to bleed into the dirt until the heat claimed him. When the news reached her, Rosa did not cry. She scrubbed floors, polished silver-basted roasts as if nothing had changed. Yet, something had. She stopped being human, not to them, for she had never been but to herself. She became something else, an echo, a shadow, a blade waiting to strike. She began to notice details others ignored. The squeak of the second stair leading to the brothers' rooms, the weight of their pocket watches, the gleam of their knives. She memorized where they left their boots, how they staggered when drunk, how long each candle burned before guttering. When she chopped firewood, she split the logs finer, cleaner, testing the edge of steel. When she polished the family's silver, her eyes reflected back at her unblinking, as though she no longer recognized the face looking out. In the quarters, Jules watched her with quiet worry. "Christmas Eve is no night for restless spirits," he murmured one evening. Rosa met his eyes and answered, "That's why they wander." Her voice was flat, certain, unshaken. As the cold deepened and Christmas approached, the brothers' cruelty grew sharper. Etienne's smile lingered too long on the young housegirls. Marcel preached longer sermons about obedience, then ordered lashings in the yard. Baptiste grew more volatile, once firing his pistol at a dog for barking during his card game. Rosa absorbed it all, silent, unyielding. The promise of freedom had been broken. In its place rose something colder, heavier, patient as frost beneath soil. Jonah was gone, but his name pulsed inside her with every breath. The cane knife no longer belonged to the harvest. It belonged to memory, to balance, to the reckoning that waited with the toll of midnight bells. And as the day of Christmas Eve finally arrived, Rosa knew that she was ready. The house at Belle Rive glowed like a lantern in the night. The windows blazed with candlelight, wreaths of holly and cypress hung heavy on the doors, and music drifted through the air, sweet as honey, but tainted by the stench of rum. Inside, the Beauregard brothers held their Christmas feast. 4 men, each different, yet bound together by blood and the arrogance of inheritance. 4 pillars of cruelty seated at a table polished with the labor of hands that trembled under their command. Lucien, the eldest at 42, sat at the head. His posture was rigid, his face long and pale, his lips curling with disdain even when he smiled. He fancied himself a philosopher, peppering his conversation with quotes from French thinkers, his voice smooth as silk, his words hollow as old cane husks. To him, slavery was not savagery, it was order. He called it the natural alignment of society, like stars set in a firmament, with men like him appointed at the center. Rosa had listened to his lectures while serving him tea, each phrase sharper than the lash. Lucien had once promised her freedom, but she now understood his promises were as empty as the bottles of Madeira he drained. Etienne. 38 leaned back in his chair with a sly smile, always watching, always waiting. He rarely raised his hand in punishment, not because he was merciful, but because his pleasures ran in darker currents. He sought out the youngest girls in the quarters, wrapping his abuse in words he called favor. Rosa remembered the face of one Celeste, barely 15, forced to pour wine with hands that shook so violently the goblet nearly spilled. Etienne reached for her waist as he laughed with his brothers, and Rosa's eyes caught the flicker of terror in the girl's glance. Etienne's cruelty left no visible scars, but the silence it carved into his victims was deeper than any whip. Marcel, 35, polished his Bible between sips of brandy. He was the pious one, or so he believed, leading prayers before every meal. Thundering sermons in the yard on Sundays while the enslaved stood in the dirt with bowed heads. His words were honeyed with scripture, yet behind them lay venom. Obedience, he proclaimed, is the highest form of worship. To Marcel, punishment was purification, and he kept a ledger of offenses in his study: names, dates, lashes. Rosa once caught a glimpse of the book while dusting the ink, neat, precise, as if he were balancing accounts. Marcel had been the one to order Jonah whipped before his sale. Rosa had not seen the blows land, but she had heard them echo through the cane fields like nails driven into her chest. Then there was Baptiste, the youngest at 28, a storm made flesh. He was taller than the others, broader in the shoulders, with a face red from brandy and temper. Baptiste carried his pistol even at the table, slamming it down beside his plate, as if daring the world to challenge him. He did not need philosophy, nor pretense of faith, nor a smile. His language was fear. Rosa remembered the day he shot a mule for stumbling under its load, laughing as it writhed in the dirt. Another time he fired at a slave child for crying during his card game, the bullet shattering the girl's arm. Baptiste had no patience, no restraint. He was a man who believed power was the right to destroy, and he wielded it without thought. Together they drank, their laughter booming against the plaster walls, their words dripping with contempt for the very people who carried their wealth on bleeding backs. On the table before them lay roasted pig oysters simmered in cream links of boudin sausage, platters of sugared pecans. Rosa had basted the meat, folded the napkins, polished the silver, until her reflection blurred in its surface. She moved among them like a shadow, serving quietly, her face an expressionless mask. But behind that mask, her mind was counting, calculating. 1 bottle, 2, 3. Each glass poured brought them closer to the edge of carelessness. At one point, Lucien raised a toast. To the house of Beauregard, he declared, voice thick with wine, may its light burn eternal. The brothers laughed, glasses clinking, their arrogance ringing as loud as the bells of midnight mass. Rosa watched the flame of a nearby candle sputter its wick, drowning in wax, and she thought no light burns eternal. The house seemed alive with contradiction. Music swelled from the corner where a trio of enslaved musicians played violins and tambourines. The notes were soft, mournful, though the brothers heard only cheer. Children upstairs, the offspring of the Beauregards and their wives, giggled in their rooms, their stockings filled with gifts, unaware of the blood that had built their comfort. Outside the quarters lay silent, the enslaved hunched together against the cold, waiting for dawn, waiting for another day of endless labor. Rosa carried a platter past the dining table, her feet gliding across polished wood. She paused only once, setting the tray down by the hearth. Her eyes lingered on the iron poker, then on the pistol strapped to Baptiste's belt, then on the wide staircase where Etienne would soon lead the young girl. Every detail fixed itself in her mind, every step measured, every breath deliberate. She was no longer a servant moving plates. She was a cartographer mapping the night. As the hours crept toward midnight, the feast grew louder. The brothers drunker, their cruelty bolder. Etienne tugged the girl's wrist. Marcel mumbled prayers. Lucien scribbled notes between sips of wine, and Baptiste barked at servants for being too slow. They believed themselves untouchable, armored by wealth and bloodline. But Rosa knew better. She had seen a candle flicker out. She had felt the cane knife heavy in her hands. She had memorized every sound of the house, the creak of the third stair, the slam of the kitchen door, the whisper of wind under the gallery. To them, she was still invisible. To herself, she was already more than flesh. She was memory sharpened into steel. And when the last bottle drained and the laughter faltered, the reckoning would begin. The day of Christmas Eve began like any other, or so it seemed to the Beauregard brothers. The house buzzed with activity servants, scurrying with garlands, fires stoked, high ovens crowded with roasts. Orders barked, doors slammed, the chaos of luxury being staged. Yet Rosa moved through it all like water through stone, unseen but absorbing every detail. Long before the guests arrived, she slipped to the yard where the cane was stacked in brittle heaps. Frost glimmered on the stalks, their sweet scent dulled by cold. She knelt behind the kitchen shed cloth bundle in her lap. With slow precision, she unwrapped the cane knife. Its blade caught the pale light of morning, a gleam that only she noticed. Rosa tested the edge with her thumb, then drew it across the whetstone. Metal against stone rang out like a hymn turned inside out, sharp, deliberate, unforgiving. She remembered Jonah's voice calling smoke a signal of hope. But tonight it would be steel that carried the message. When the knife was ready, she rubbed a cloth soaked in lard along its edge. Not to soften it, but to prepare it. Lard muffled hinges, oiled locks, and quieted footsteps. Every tool in the quarters had its second use, if one only looked. Rosa had learned to look. Later in the quarters, children played as they always did. Their laughter rose thin against the wind, their game a mimicry of the adults they watched daily. With sticks they swung at stalks of cane, shouting triumphantly as though felling giants. Rosa stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched them for a moment. Once their play might have made her smile. Now it cut her deeper than any lash. The game was prophecy. Tonight their play would come alive, and the cane knife would fall not on stalks, but on flesh. She turned back inside, and there was Jules again, seated close to the fire. His hands trembled as he fed kindling into the flame, the orange glow flickering over his lined face. He spoke without looking at her. "You carry silence like a stone, girl, but even stones break if thrown hard enough." Rosa met his words with calm. "Stones can break," she said, "but they can also crush." Jules's eyes lifted, searching her face, but she offered him no more. He sighed and muttered a prayer, this time louder, as if he meant the walls to hear. As dusk fell, Rosa returned to the house. The brothers had begun to gather their boots thudding across polished floors, their voices echoing down long halls. She slipped through the servant corridors, carrying trays, straightening linens, bowing when summoned. Yet every movement was rehearsed deliberate. She lingered by the mantel longer than needed fingers brushing the iron poker. She bent to stoke the fire and watched the flames lick upward, imagining for a moment Jonah's face in the glow. She adjusted a candle on the table, knowing how quickly wax could drown a flame, how easily a light could vanish. Etienne noticed nothing as he winked at the girl beside him. Marcel, already drunk, began quoting scripture in French, his words slurred. Baptiste growled at the cook for burning a sausage that was not burned at all. Lucien, poised as ever, scribbled notes in his ledger, muttering about prophets. None of them saw Rosa's eyes. None of them recognized the stillness that coiled around her like smoke. In the kitchen, she gathered what she would need: a rag soaked in lard to silence hinges, a spare apron to wrap the blade, a shawl that smelled faintly of smoke to hide her intent beneath ordinary fabric. She tucked them into a gap behind barrels of salted fish near the smokehouse, each item hidden with the care of ritual. Then she walked back slowly, as though memorizing every step, every breath, every sound of the night. Outside, the bells of the parish church began to ring again, calling the faithful to midnight mass. The sound floated across the fields, threading through the cold air. To others, it meant salvation, the birth of Christ, a night of peace. To Rosa, it was a dirge, a toll for Jonah, for the children lost, for every scar carved into her back and into memory. Each note hammered against her chest like a warning drum, yet also like permission. She looked once more at the big house blazing with light. Music spilled from its windows, violins racing through carols. The brothers' voices rose above the melody, loud and careless. The house seemed untouchable, as if the walls themselves were woven from arrogance. Rosa knew better. She had walked its halls, scrubbed its floors, memorized its weaknesses. The third step on the staircase groaned when pressed. The latch on the gallery door had never been fixed. The linen chest in the hallway was deep enough to hide a blade until the moment it was needed. As she stepped back into the servant passage, she whispered the names again, a litany to guide her hand. Jonah, Mama, Celeste, the lost ones. With each name, her breath grew steadier, her spine straighter. She was no longer a woman serving at a table. She was a shadow woven from memory and sharpened by grief. By the time the bells fell silent and the last hymn echoed away, Rosa had already decided. Tonight, she would not pray. Tonight, she would not wait. Tonight, she would act. And somewhere deep inside the great house of Belle Rive, the first candle sputtered and died. The house of Beauregard was drunk on itself. Midnight approached and the feast had dissolved into chaos. Plates of oysters and roast pig lay half-eaten on the table. Wine bottles tipped against silver trays, candle wax dripping into pools across the linen. The musicians had been dismissed, their instruments silent, and only the heavy laughter of the brothers remained echoing like thunder through the plastered halls. Lucien rubbed his temples, muttering that the noise gave him headaches. He rose from the table with a ledger in hand, his glass of Madeira still half full, and withdrew into his office. There, among stacks of sugar accounts and maps of fields, he sought quiet, believing the night was his to command. Etienne, smiling as ever, had coaxed Celeste toward the stairs. Her steps faltered, her face pale, yet he guided her with a hand at her waist, as though she were a guest instead of prey. Marcel slouched near the fire, his Bible slipping from his lap, murmuring fractured scripture between gulps of liquor. And Baptiste stormed from room to room, pistol swinging at his hip, his voice booming as he cursed servants for imagined mistakes. Rosa had watched them scatter, each brother in his place, each one blind to the rhythm building in her chest. She moved quietly through the servant halls, her shoes whispering against the boards, her breaths counting the tolls of midnight bells. When she reached the linen chest in the corridor, she paused. Her hands slid beneath folded sheets, finding the cloth bundle hidden there. She unwrapped it slowly, and the cane knife gleamed in the dim light of the wall lamp. The blade no longer belonged to the fields. It belonged to names, to memory. Rosa whispered them again, Hona, Mama Celeste. The children lost and felt the steel hum against her palm. Her grip was firm, her arms steady. She closed the chest, pulled the apron tight around her waist, and stepped into the hallway with the knife concealed beneath folds of cloth. The house breathed around her, oblivious. Firelight flickered on portraits of ancestors whose faces glared down with pride and cruelty. The air smelled of cinnamon smoke and spilled wine. A draft whispered through the gallery door, rattling the latch, the same latch Rosa had oiled days before to silence it. Everything was as she had planned, as if the house itself conspired with her. She turned first toward the office. Through the door, she heard Lucien's voice muttering as he scratched his pen across paper, tallying profits from the season. Rosa pushed the door open gently. It gave a soft sigh, no more than the settling of wood. Lucien did not look up at once. "Is the fire low?" he asked. Distracted, his eyes still on his ledger, Rosa stepped closer, her silence the only answer. Finally, he glanced up, confusion flickering across his pale features. "Rosa." His voice wavered, sluggish from drink. "What is it you need?" She said nothing. She had rehearsed this moment in silence too many times for word. One step, two, then the cane knife rose. Her arms did not tremble. The blade came down in a single practiced arc. The sound was not of wood splitting nor of cane breaking. It was something heavier, final. Lucien's body jerked, his pen sliding across the ledger in a red line that bled into numbers. His glass toppled, shattering against the rug. Rosa stood over him, breathing steady, watching the life slip from his body. His promise of freedom had been a lie, his philosophy a mask for cruelty. Now his silence was the only truth he had left. She reached out, turned down the lamp to dim the light, and closed the door behind her with care, as though leaving a room where someone merely slept. One brother was gone. Back in the hall, laughter still echoed faintly from the parlor, where Marcel mumbled prayers, and from upstairs came the creak of steps as Etienne led Celeste toward a locked room. Baptiste's boots thudded somewhere in the distance, his curses rising, his pistol clattering against his belt. None of them yet noticed the silence in the office, the ledger left unfinished, the candle guttering in the dark. Rosa adjusted her apron, wiped the blade against the cloth, and listened. The house was vast but not infinite. She had memorized its heartbeat, and tonight she would cut it vein by vein until it stilled. She stepped into the hallway, the cane knife hidden once more at her side. A draft swept through the gallery, carrying the faint toll of bells from the parish church. To Rosa, it was not a call to worship, but a drumbeat counting the dead. She whispered Jonah's name again, steady as breath. Then she turned toward the stairs. For above, Etienne waited with his wine-slick smile, and Celeste's footsteps faltered on the creaking boards. The staircase creaked beneath Rosa's feet as she climbed, the cane knife hidden beneath her apron. The air at the top of the stairs was heavy with perfume and wine, and from behind a closed door came a muffled sound, a whimper barely audible, followed by Etienne's low, coaxing voice. Rosa's jaw tightened. She had seen the fear in Celeste's eyes all evening. Now the girl was cornered, trapped behind that door with the man who believed her silence was his privilege. Rosa knocked once softly, like a servant summoned. The voice inside paused. Footsteps crossed the floor. The door opened just enough for Etienne's face to appear, hair disheveled, shirt half undone, a sickly smile curving his lips. "Rosa," he said, eyes glinting. "What is it you want at this hour?" She did not answer. She stepped forward, the door swinging wider as the blade rose. Etienne's smile faltered into confusion, then terror. The cane knife came down, biting into the curve of his shoulder. He screamed, staggering backward, clutching at the wound as blood spilled across his chest. Rosa entered without hesitation, closing the door behind her. Etienne fell to the floor, gasping, hands scrambling toward the hearth poker. She pressed her foot against his wrist, pinned it, and struck again. The second blow silenced him, leaving only the ragged sound of his last breath. In the corner, Celeste huddled beneath a blanket, wide-eyed, her small frame trembling. Rosa lowered the blade, blood dripping onto the rug, and knelt. Her voice, when it came, was calm and steady. "Go to Tante Marie in the cookhouse. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone until morning." Celeste stared at her, frozen. Rosa reached out, took the girl's hand, and pressed it gently. "Run." The girl nodded and slipped past her feet, silent as shadows. Rosa stood again, breathing heavy but controlled. Two were gone now. Downstairs, Marcel stirred in his chair by the fire. He had been drifting between drink and scripture, his Bible open on his lap pages, smudged with wine. When Rosa entered the parlor, the blade wrapped again in her apron. He blinked at her in confusion. His eyes fell on the stains across her dress, the smear of blood at her cuff, and his lips trembled. "Rosa, what is this? Where's Lucien Etienne?" His words slurred, but fear sharpened them. She said nothing. He rose unsteady, clutching the Bible to his chest as though it could shield him. "No. Girl, don't you know what day it is? It's Christmas. You can't." His voice cracked, desperation spilling out. Rosa stepped forward, unwrapping the blade. The firelight caught the steel and his knees gave way. He fell back against the stairs, the Bible sliding from his hands. "Forgive," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "God commands forgiveness." Rosa's eyes were cold. "Then let him forgive you," she said, and raised the knife. The blade fell, once swift, ending his sermon forever. She left him sprawled at the base of the stairs, the Bible lying open beside him, its words drowned in blood. 3 brothers silenced, and 1 remained. Baptiste. The youngest had not been drinking quietly. His voice boomed through the halls, calling her name, now, not as a servant but as prey. "Rosa," he roared, his boots hammering the floors. "I know what you've done. Come out, you witch, I'll cut you down myself." The click of his pistol echoed as he cocked it, the sound sharp and vicious. Rosa stood in the dining room, the long table still set with silver glasses and meat gone cold. She placed the knife on the table for a moment, breathing steady. The flicker of dying candles threw long shadows across the room, shadows that seemed to move with her heartbeat. She didn't run, she waited. Baptiste stormed in, eyes, wild, shirt half open, face red with rage. He saw her standing there, calm as stone, and his lip curled. "You think this is over?" he spat, raising the pistol. Rosa did not flinch. The gun fired, the shot thundering through the room, splintering a chair behind her. He cursed, fumbling to reload, his hands clumsy with fury. Rosa moved. 3 strides carried her across the room. The blade rose, fell, and struck. Baptiste screamed, staggering back, his pistol clattering to the floor. She struck again and again, precise, relentless. His voice cracked into a howl, then a gurgle, then nothing at all. When it was done, Rosa stood in silence, her breath loud in her ears, her arms steady, though blood soaked her apron. The great house of Belle Rive had gone quiet. No more laughter, no more scripture, no more boasts. Only the crackle of embers in the hearth and the slow drip of blood onto marble. 4 brothers, 4 debts repaid. Rosa pulled out a chair at the head of the table and sat, placing the cane knife beside her on polished wood. She poured herself a glass of red wine from the bottle left half empty, the liquid catching the glow of the fire. She raised it not in celebration, but in memory. Jonah Mama Celeste, the nameless lost. She drank the taste, sharp, bitter, and final. The house was no longer theirs. For the first time, it was silent enough to hear the truth. And in that silence, Rosa waited for dawn. Dawn crept slowly across the cane fields, the frost glistening like shards of glass beneath the pale winter sun. Belle Rive stood quiet, its great windows still glowing faintly from candles burned to stubs. Inside, the silence was heavier than the night itself. 4 brothers lay where they had fallen, Lucien at his desk, his ledger streaked red, Etienne in his chamber, eyes wide in disbelief. Marcel at the foot of the stairs, the Bible open to a page stained dark. Baptiste sprawled across the dining room floor, pistol frozen in his lifeless hand. And at the head of the table sat Rosa, back straight, eyes open, the cane knife resting by her side. She had not moved since the last blow. Her apron was soaked, her arms streaked in crimson, but her face was calm, composed, almost regal. To anyone who entered, she would have looked less like a servant caught in madness and more like a queen presiding over judgment. It was a neighbor who sounded the alarm. From the levee, he had seen smoke trailing strangely from the chimneys, too thin, too pale, and sent a rider into town. By morning, a posse of parish constables arrived, armed and pale, their boots crunching across frozen earth. They entered the mansion with caution pistols drawn as though expecting ambush. What they found was worse than any ambush carnage, written across velvet carpet's walls, spattered with truth that no ledger could erase. And Rosa, she did not flee, did not resist. She sat waiting. When they bound her wrists with rope, she did not flinch. When they led her down the steps of Belle Rive, she turned her face toward the fields, staring across rows of cane, stiff with frost. She looked not at the men dragging her away, but at the land where Jonah had once sung to ease his labor, where children had been born in dirt, where the lost were buried without markers. She seemed to listen, and in the hush of the morning, it was as if the fields whispered back her name. Word spread faster than the river current. By evening, all of St. James Parish buzzed with the news: 4 Beauregard brothers slain by a woman from their own household. The New Orleans newspapers called it savagery madness, the River Road Massacre. They printed only her first name, Rosa, as if stripping her surname would strip her power. They painted her as deranged, unnatural, a beast in woman's form. But in the quarters, in whispers over cook fires, and in the shadows of the cane rows, her story carried a different shape. They spoke of her not with scorn, but with awe. A woman who had not run, who had not begged, but who had turned the master's blade back on him. The trial was swift, as everyone knew it would be. 2 days in the parish courthouse at Donaldsonville, the room heavy with the smell of sweat and ink. The jury was white, the verdict foregone. 30 minutes deliberation, and the word came down guilty. Rosa showed no expression. She didn't beg, did not explain. She sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on a sliver of sky visible through the high windows. When the judge pronounced her sentence death by hanging, she did not lower her eyes. In the jail, she remained silent. Guards whispered that she prayed. Others swore she simply sat by the barred window, eyes closed, lips moving as if reciting names. Jonah, Mama, Celeste, and all the nameless ones whose cries had been swallowed by the walls of Belle Rive. Each name a breath, each breath a defiance. On the morning of her execution, they dressed her in white. They said it was custom, a mark of purity, though none understood the irony. White was not their color. It belonged to her now, a shroud that made her appear less like a prisoner and more like a bride walking toward an altar. Crowds gathered, some jeering, some silent, some unable to look away. When asked for her last words, Rosa looked straight ahead, her voice steady. "I only did what they taught me." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some spat in disgust, others shivered as if struck by cold. The noose tightened. The trapdoor fell in her body, stilled. But her story did not. That night and the nights that followed, her name traveled the river road faster than any sermon. Mothers whispered it to their daughters as they braided their hair. Old men spoke it around fires as if invoking a spell. Children etched it into the dirt with sticks, the same sticks they once used to play at chopping cane. Rosa, a name no whip could erase, no gallows could silence. Her legend spread beyond the parish, carried downriver to New Orleans, upriver into Baton Rouge, across swamps and rice fields into Alabama and the Carolinas. Her story became more than a tale of blood. It became a reminder that memory sharpens, that silence is not emptiness, but waiting, that even the bound can strike deep when the night is long enough. They buried her body in an unmarked grave as they had so many others. But Rosa was no longer only a body. She had become memory planted in soil, and memory grows wild. And so whenever the bells of Christmas Eve rang along the river road, some swore they could hear another sound carried on the wind, a faint whisper like steel drawn across stone, like a litany recited beneath the stars. A whisper that said, even in silence, even in chains, no one forgets.